Hello, fellow fantasy readers. Welcome back to Diamond Painting and Dr. Pepper. My name is Kate, and today we're going to be doing our next video in my Way of Kings Readalong series. So we're going to be talking today about the prelude, the prologue, and chapters 1 through 6. And there will be spoilers in this video, so just a heads up, if you haven't read all the way to chapter 7 yet, you might want to wait on this video till you catch up to that mark in the book. So as I've mentioned before, I've never hosted a read-along before, and I'm not exactly sure how this video is going to go and exactly what I'm going to cover and how long it's going to be. So we'll find out together. I do want to say thank you for joining, and I hope that you are enjoying the book so far. I'm not really sure what I'm going to be showing on the screen. I'll probably just take some footage of me diamond painting and show that so you have something to look at if you need something to look at. Otherwise, you could just treat this as a podcast and listen to it without watching the screen. But yeah, what I'm doing on the screen isn't going to have much to do with what I'm talking about, so it's just there to provide something for the eyes. So that said, I guess we should get started talking about the prelude, which takes place about 4,500 years before the rest of the book. And I remember the first time that I read this book, I was pretty confused about what was going on in this part, because you're kind of just dropped into what feels like the end of something big. And you're not quite sure what was happening. And this is a pretty short prelude. It's only a few pages. And some of the things that are mentioned seem pretty important, but it's hard to know exactly what to focus on and which things are important the first time you read through it. But I do want to say that it does become more clear later on in the book what's going on here in this prelude. So we start out following a guy named Kalak, and it looks like he's wandering through a battlefield, and there's talk of enormous monster-like rock beings called thunderclasts. And then we also see that some of the people are in primitive clothing with bronze spears, and they're fighting next to more advanced soldiers in fancy armor. And it seems kind of weird to have that juxtaposition, but we get the feeling that they have won this battle, even if we're not quite sure who they were fighting against. It only mentions those monstrous beasts and then some kind of enemy. In fact, Kalak says in part of the prelude, he will not remain bound by this, the enemy. He will find a way around it. You know he will. And this is as they're talking of breaking some kind of oath pact that these 10 people have made, and that during this battle they just fought, 9 of them survived while 1 has died. And apparently this isn't the first time they've fought this kind of battle, and sometimes a few of them die, sometimes all of them die, but whether they die or not, they're forced to return to a place of torture after the battle is over. It says, when he died, he was sent back, no choice. When he survived the desolation, he was supposed to go back as well, back to that place that he dreaded, back to that place of pain and fire. What if he just decided not to go? So what we can take from this interlude is that for some reason these 10 people have made some kind of pact where they will fight these battles in this world, and then when they die, or even if they don't die, when they win and the battle is over, they will be sent back to this place of torture and darkness for however long. And then the cycle repeats itself, and somehow this pact that they've made keeps their enemy at bay. And that's pretty much all we know about that, except for the fact that 9 of them survived this time and decided not to go through with their oath and not to go back to that place. And instead, they've just let the one man who did die in this battle go back alone and deal with all the torture by himself while they go on living in the world. So we get a pretty clear sense that this is going to have big implications for the world that they're on somehow, but it isn't clear at this point what exactly that's going to mean or how it's all connected to the rest of the story, especially since from here we jump to the prologue and immediately it says 4,500 years later. So now we're on the prologue, and the first thing I want to talk about is that we have a little quote here right before we get into the story, and it talks about how it was collected on the first day of the week, etc., 31 seconds before death. And so someone is collecting these quotes from all different types of people right before they die. And we don't know what the purpose of this is or how it's connected to anything, but there is one before every chapter. So that's always kind of an interesting little tidbit to read. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the chapter that we're going to be reading, but we kind of get the feeling that it has some relevance to something, and that's not explained yet. For the prologue, the first line, I don't know, it's kind of a nostalgic line for me. And people talk about the beginning lines of books all the time. This isn't the beginning line of the book, but I just think it's a really impactful sentence. So I'll read it here. Zeth's son Villano, truthless of Shinovar, wore white on the day he was to kill a king. Reading back on that after having read all 4 current books in the series, just kind of, it really resonates with me. So if this is your first time reading, it might not have resonated with you so much, but I think it still has a lot to say. So it sets up the rest of the prologue. We are talking about this assassin who is going to kill a king. We don't know yet who the king is. We know this assassin is called Truthless. In other words, he has not been honest or has been accused of not being honest about something, but we don't know what. But he's wearing white, and that's something unusual, I feel like, for assassins. Most of the time when we think about assassins, we think about darkness and trying to blend in and wearing black, and also white is often associated with innocence and purity, and it doesn't seem to fit with an assassin. And I think all of that is kind of gently nudging us to wonder about this person's situation. And it does talk a little bit more in the prologue about how he has like masters. Someone holds his contract and he doesn't have any say on what he does and who he kills and when, or even what he wears to do the killing. And as we go through this scene with him, we see him doing things that it seems like nobody in this world, or at least in this castle that he's in, has seen before. So this is something new and mystifying. And I love how Sanderson uses this prologue to kind of start to explain the magic system of this book with the Stormlight and how Zeth kind of sucks it in to himself and then uses it to power what he's doing. And we even get the explanations of the 3 different types of lashings that he's able to create and what each of them do and kind of what are some of the rules for them. And I love a hard magic system. I like knowing that the system has rules and limitations. And this is a good way to kind of set that up right from the beginning. And we also get our first introduction to shard blades and shard plate. So Zeth has a shard blade and it can cut through anything except when it gets to living matter like skin. It doesn't cut that, but if it passes through somebody's body, it instead cuts off like the soul basically. So if he cuts through an arm, that arm is now dead and unusable. If he cuts through the spine or the neck or anything like that, then their eyes kind of burn out and they're just dead. And it's like he has severed the soul from their body. So shard blades, according to legend, it says, the shard blades were first carried by the knights radiant, uncounted ages ago, gifts of their god, granted to allow them to fight horrors of rock and flame, dozens of feet tall, foes whose eyes burned with hatred, the Voidbringers. So this kind of sounds similar to the Thunderclasts that we learned about in the Prelude, and it would make sense to need a weapon that could cut through rock if that's what the Thunderclasts were made of. And that's what these shard blades do. They just slice right through it as if it were nothing, but apparently also very adept at killing regular men too. And then he's confronted with a man in shard plate and has to fight this shard bearer is what they're called. And we kind of see that even with his special magical abilities and stormlight abilities, it's still a heck of a fight for him to get through this shard plate. So this armor is very formidable, even in a fight against someone who has this stormlight magic and a shard blade. But even though they're very powerful, I think it's pretty clear that the stormlight powers just give Szeth the edge, even without the armor. As he mentions, he either has to use his powers or use armor like that, and the powers definitely give him the advantage. And it's really only a matter of time before he's going to come out on top in that fight. And then I thought it was really interesting, I remember the first time I read it, that even though Szeth doesn't have a choice in even whether or not he can choose to lose a fight, he has to try his best to do his master's bidding. He still has some choice in honoring a dead man's final request, because to his people, a dying request is sacred. So he makes sure to do what the king asks, even though he didn't really know what it meant. So Szeth is a very interesting character. I remember being really intrigued by him, and I'm excited to learn more about him and how he plays into the greater story, as well as why his masters ordered the king killed right after they had signed a treaty with the king. It doesn't seem to make any sense. So now we've got a couple mysteries already, and we've only been through the prelude and the prologue. So I love a book that has a good mystery, and this one had me hooked with those two things right from the beginning. But then for part 1 and chapter 1, we jump ahead another 5 years. So we've read 2 kind of little chapters already, and both of them have been kind of self-contained, and now we're on to a different timeline, and we're starting with a whole different set of characters. And Amanda, who joined my read-along group on Goodreads, actually mentioned how it's interesting that Sanderson chooses to introduce us to our main character, Kaladin, through the eyes of someone else in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, we're reading from the point of view of a young kid called Sen, who is a new recruit into an army, and he's only like 15, and he gets put into Kaladin's squad, and he finds out that Kaladin paid to have him put there, and he's confused as to why Kaladin would do that when he's a new recruit and so young and everything. And then throughout this chapter, he's being taught how to work in a unit and how to fight as a group so that there are less casualties. And we see that Kaladin has paid off the healers to come carry the wounded from his squads off the field so that he can try to keep as many of his squad alive as possible. So we can tell that to Kaladin, all of the lives of the members of his team are very important to him, and he does what he can, going above and beyond to make sure he keeps everyone alive. And he goes out of his way to do that with the weakest members of the army, which is why it's extra confusing when we get to the end of this chapter and we start chapter 2, and it's 8 months later, and suddenly Kaladin, as we're seeing through his point of view for the first time, is trapped in a slave wagon and has been branded a dangerous slave. And we don't know what could have happened to get him to that point, because he seemed like such a successful officer in the army in chapter 1 through Sen's eyes. And we're kind of jumped forward ahead in time again for a third time, but it's only 8 months this time. Anyway, it's an interesting juxtaposition to see him in this position. He's pretty much lost hope. We find out he's had many escape attempts in the past, and he's always been recaptured. And he's to the point now where he's just kind of given up. And that's contrasted with how he was in chapter 1, where he was fighting for something and he had goals and he was protecting everyone he could. And now he has kind of withdrawn into himself and he won't talk to the other slaves. And he kind of takes all the blame upon himself. He's kind of feeling like every time he tries to make things better for other people, he only ends up making things worse, because every person he had ever tried to protect has ended up dead. And one of the only clues we get in this chapter of what happened is where he's thinking to himself, were there men who had honor? No, Kaladin thought. Honor died 8 months ago. So we know that something happened 8 months ago, maybe that very day from chapter 1. But we don't know exactly what is meant by this yet, so there's another mystery for us. Meanwhile, he keeps getting visited by a spren, and we've had little notes here and there about spren up until now in these chapters. They seem to be creatures that appear when humans are feeling different emotions, but there's also spren that are related to the elements. So he's being visited by a wind spren, and she seems to be an unusual spren because she takes on different forms and she hangs around Kaladin a lot. And typically wind spren, they don't remember things well enough to stick around in one place and form relationships or call people by name. And this spren is different. She knows his name and she says his name and he's surprised. Plus, other people can't seem to see her. So he starts to think maybe he's going crazy. So throughout the chapter, he's talking to himself like he's completely given up. But then we see him try one more time to save another slave, and it doesn't work out for him. And then he fails at poisoning the slaver because he had been saving a poisonous leaf to try that with, and in his anger he crushes and drops it and it blows away, and so he can't even do that right, and he feels completely defeated, and he's just not in a good place at the end of this chapter. Then for chapter 3, we're introduced again to a new character, Shalon, who is arriving at a city called Kharbranth after a long journey of trying to track down a woman who she is hoping to offer herself to as a ward and be trained by this scholar. I love Shalon's interactions with the sailors here, and it seems she really likes to use words to kind of twist others around and make them feel a little bit perplexed, or to make them laugh, or to make herself laugh. And we get the feeling that this is not something that has been encouraged in her life, that as a young noble woman, she should be less playful and less witty, and that that's not really her station in life. But she has followed this noble woman, Yasna, for about 6 months after she was told to come and apply for wardship, and Yasna keeps jumping around to different locations, and by the time Shalon catches up to where she was last, all she finds is a note to go find her at the next place. And we find out later in chapter 5 that this was actually part of a test Yasna was performing on her and other prospective wards to see how long they'll pursue her and how serious they are about wanting the wardship. I'm kind of going to talk about chapter 3 and chapter 5 together because they sort of make more sense when I talk about them all at once instead of sticking another Kaladin chapter here in the middle. And here we get introduced to another type of magic called soul casting. So Yasna has a device that goes on her hand, and she uses the power of the gems on the device to kind of transmute a stone or some rock into smoke. And we learned that this can be done to transmute pretty much anything into anything else. So they can make rock into food or grain, etc. And we learn that towards the end, and then finally at the end of this chapter, we learn that Shallan's real goal in becoming Yasna's ward is to steal Yasna's soulcaster, because apparently the one that Shallan's father had was broken and not working. And she is frustratingly thwarted in this goal when, after following Yasna around for 6 months, she is pretty swiftly dismissed as a prospective ward. But since she and her family are in such a desperate situation, she decides she's not going to give up, and she's going to try again to earn the wardship so that she can steal the soulcaster and pay off her family's debts. So I kind of combined chapters 3 and 5 there to talk about Shallan all at once, because it seemed to make more sense that way. It gave me more to talk about. And so now we need to go back to chapter 4 and then chapter 6 to talk about what's going on with Kaladin. So the slavers get a bit lost, and Kaladin manages to convince Tvlakv to bring him the map, and then he rips it up and lets it travel away in the wind, which I thought was pretty funny. But then we get some interesting dialogue between Kaladin and the slave master, where we find out that Kaladin was actually sold into slavery by High Lord Amaram. So we get a little bit of a clue about how he became a slave, but we're still not sure why, because Tvlakv calls him a deserter, but then goes on to say that that's not really true, and that's not really why Kaladin is a slave. So he says, "Men guilty of high crimes, they do not sell so well. With that shash glyph on your head, it will be difficult enough to get a good price for you. If I cannot sell you, then you will not wish for that status. So we will play a game together. I will say you are a deserter, and you will say nothing. It is an easy game, I think." So Kaladin has done something other than deserting that would make him even harder to sell if people knew. So that kind of narrows the list down to probably just a few things. And then I like this moment later where he's talking to the Windspren, and he says he almost finds himself liking the slave master Tvlakv, and she's like, after what he did when he killed that other slave. And I love this line from Kaladin. "I didn't say Tvlakv isn't a bastard. He's just a likable bastard." He hesitated, then grimaced. "Those are the worst kind. When you kill them, you end up feeling guilty for it." So then it's time for a high storm, and apparently the wagon is able to convert into kind of a shelter for the slaves. The walls can go up and protect them a bit from the worst of the storms, and the slave master has a compartment underneath where he can go and be even more protected from the storm. And then when the worst of the storm is over, the slavers come and take down most of the walls so that they can give the slaves a bath, let the high storm get them clean. And apparently this time they opened up the walls a little bit early, so Kaladin asks why, and one of the slavers, Bluth, just says that the master wants them extra clean today, so that leads Kaladin to think that they are almost at their destination, which turns out to be true. But before we talk about the Shattered Plains, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the chulls that are pulling the wagon. So one of my favorite parts about this book is the world building, and these wagons aren't being pulled by something that we'd be familiar with, like oxen or even horses. They're being pulled by these giant crab-like creatures with big shells that are really tame but could probably tear your arm off if they wanted to. And the visual of that in my brain, it makes it very clear that we're talking about a place that's so different from anything we're used to. And that's really interesting to me. Anyway, so yeah, later on they arrive at the Shattered Plains, and it's described like this. It was an enormous riven plain of rock, so wide he couldn't see the other side, that was split and cut by sheer chasms, crevasses 20 or 30 feet wide. The expansive plain looked like a platter that had been broken, its pieces then reassembled with small gaps between the fragments. And here he talks about how he's kind of in disbelief that they're at the Shattered Plains, and he says because that's what Tien had wanted. And this isn't the first time he's mentioned Tien, and we're not sure who Tien is yet, but it was obviously someone important to Kaladin and someone that he feels he failed. So that will come back into play later. But at the end of this chapter, we find that Kaladin gets a little spark of hope that maybe he'll be able to join the army here at the Shattered Plains and fight again. And it says if there was one thing he still let himself long for, it was the chance to hold a spear, to fight again, to try and find his way back to the man he had been, a man who had cared. So even though it seems like he loses hope over and over again, just even in the beginning part of this book, he still manages to find things to hope for to keep him going. Okay, now we're to chapter 6, and you guys, when I made the breakdown of these chapters, I could not have landed on a better ending chapter for our first section. This chapter is kind of iconic. You get thrown into this world of the Shattered Plains and what it means to be a bridgeman. So at first, Kaladin tries to tell the light-eyed woman who comes to look at the slaves and possibly purchase them that he is a murderer and that he could still fight, and he's hoping she will purchase him and put him in the army to be a fighter. And Tavlakov tells the woman that he's not a murderer, he's a deserter. And this kind of dashes all of Kaladin's hopes because as a deserter, he wouldn't be trusted to be a regular soldier. And Tavlakov knows this, and he even kind of apologizes for it afterwards. But the woman does end up buying all the slaves, and she sends Kaladin to be a bridgeman, which he initially starts out thinking is someone who goes logging and then builds bridges, but it turns out to be something different entirely. And right off the bat, he ends up pissing off his superior officer, Gaz. And so Gaz immediately sends him to run at the worst part of the bridge run. Because, of course, a bridge run is called as soon as Kaladin gets to the Shattered Plains and gets assigned to a bridge crew. So they have these really large bridges, and it takes about 35 to 40 men to pick one up. And these men, the bridges have like handles and cutouts where their heads can go. Kaladin gets assigned to the back, which means he can't see. He's kind of just running along, and he's got this bridge resting on his shoulders, along with, the other 34 to 39 men. And they run all day with this thing, and every time they get to a chasm or one of the cracks in these Shattered Plains, they have to drop this heavy bridge and then push it forward to let the army go over the bridge to the next plateau. And then they have to pick up the bridge again on the other side and continue going. So by the time they've been through a few of these stop, drop, and push the bridge forward and then let the army go, and then they have to run past the army again and go faster than the army to get to the next plateau before the army so they can drop the bridge and let the army go. And eventually they get to their final destination, and here Gaz has everybody switch, and he tells Kaladin, okay, you go to the front now, and everyone who is in the front goes to the back. And Kaladin at first is relieved because, hey, now he can see where he's going. It's much easier to run. But then he realizes what that actually means, because what happens is they've now gotten to the point where they're about to engage the enemy, and the bridge crew is running directly at the enemy army with no protection as they're trying to get the bridge close enough to the chasm to push it across for the army. And the whole time they're just being picked off by arrows. And everybody in the front row obviously is easy pickings. So miraculously, Kaladin does not get shot, but I think both of the men on either side of him do, including one who has been kind of helping him along the entire time and teaching him what to do. And then when they put the bridge down and push it across, Kaladin almost falls. And we get another mention of Tien again. It says, he teetered, one hand dangling above the void, the other gripping the edge. His overextended mind wavered with vertigo as he stared down that sheer cliff down into darkness. The height was beautiful. He'd always loved climbing high rock formations with Tien. But he manages to shove himself back up onto the plateau and to safety, well, relative safety. He has a passing thought of going to try to find the man who had helped him and see if he can help heal his wounds, but he's just too exhausted to even get there and just kind of passes out right there on the battlefield. So in case you guys are having trouble visualizing what this bridge looks like or what the crossings look like, I did find an image online, and I'll put it here on the screen to kind of show you some sketches of the bridge and how it would look when they're pushing it across the chasms and everything. I'll try to find the artist, but I had it linked to me from someone in a group, and they didn't link the artist, but I'll see if I can find that. Anyway, Kaladin passes out, and when he is awoken, it's the Windspren that wakes him, and she says he has to get up or they'll leave him behind. So there are other members of the bridge crew kind of checking the dead bridge crew members for any padding that they might have had, but since Kaladin hadn't been given any padding, they wouldn't have checked him. They would have just left him. But he was able to get himself a vest from the bridgeman who had helped him and passed away. In that process, he also learns that the Spren he's been talking to has a name. And she seems kind of surprised by the fact that she has a name. But it's Silfrena, or Sil for short. I love that these two are just building up their relationship, and it's becoming more normal to Kaladin to have her around, even though it's not something that's typical for a Windspren. He's starting to take it for granted that she's going to be hanging around. And then they have to run all the way back to the camp with like half the amount of bridge crew because about half of them have died in this attack. And they do get some help from the soldiers, but only because it takes at least 25 men to lift the bridge. So then at the end of the chapter, it talks about how Kaladin had thought there was nothing more terrible than failing those he'd sworn to protect. Then it says, it appeared he'd been wrong. There had been something more they could do to him. One final torment the world had reserved just for Kaladin, and it was called Bridge 4. So that is a wrap for this week's read-along video. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is still very new to me, and I feel like it was a bit clunky in what I decided to talk about and which order I talked about it in. But please let me know some feedback down below so that I can make future videos better. Let me know what you thought about the length and whether or not you felt the balance was good or if I should make things shorter. Other than feedback about this video, I'd also like to know how you guys are doing with the reading. Was 126 pages about a good amount for a week's worth of reading? And what do you think so far about the first few chapters of this book? I can't wait to see how you guys are feeling about it as we move along here. If you leave comments on this video about the book, please keep it to just this section up to chapter 6, and I might read some of them in my next video before we get into the discussion about the next section. Feel free to either comment here on this video, or you can join my read-along group on Goodreads. I'll have my Goodreads profile linked in the description, and I think you have to friend me before you can join the group. So just let me know that you want to join the group, and I will add you once we're friends on Goodreads. And thank you so much for watching and joining this read along. I'm really excited to go through the rest of this book with you, and I hope this first installment has been engaging and that you had fun listening. So that said, I will see you guys on Sunday for my next Whip and Chat video. Bye, everybody.